La vérité touche au réel.
Young Zizekians have assembled. We have a very special guest. We have a special guest with us. Brian Becker, Dr. Todd McGowan himself, the inimitable Russell Spriglia, Isabel Millar.
Engaging in consciousness. In the imaginary domain, we have an intersubjective dialectic.
Vanishing mediators.
All right, what is going on, everybody? It is the Three Musketeers, the Vanishing Mediators, back at it again with another banger concerning Seminar 3 on psychosis. The last chapter we left off on was Chapter 9 on the nonsense and the structure of God. And now we are on Chapter 10 or Lecture 10, titled On the Signifier in the because the last time we left off, we had this interesting quilting in Lacan's thought of the question concerning Schreber's God, and does God intervene not only with human affairs, but also with questions concerning chance, and can God predict the lottery? Which I think is a really interesting question, guys. What do you think about that before I get into my segment?
I have to add a correction from last time, because I remember last time I said he dismisses the question of the chance, but I looked again at my Schreber coffee table book, right? And he basically says, this was a footnote, that's why I missed it, but he says God cannot know what happens by chance. So he cannot know the future, but he can make the future. And he thinks really practical through that. Like he says, God created the world. So he set up all the laws in the universe, kind of created all the beings, but he doesn't have control about what happens. Only in the sense that he can intervene through miracles. And he basically says he could make the future in the sense that he could draw the attention. So he knows where the numbers are, right? And he can draw the attention of the person who draws the number to a certain letter or to a certain number, to a certain piece of paper in the lottery, and direct their arms through the muscles to pick that certain number. Yeah, that's basically what he says. But God, he cannot know the future, but he can make it by doing the miracles.
Right.
To add that correction from last time.
For sure, yeah. All right. So I think this chapter is really interesting because now we're getting into the deep questions of not only Schreber's delusions and hallucinations. To make the distinction, we got hallucinations and delusions as, we could say, quote unquote, symptoms or structures of Schreber's psychosis, and also the questions concerning reality, the real, and the signifier and its relation to begetting meaning. So the start of the seminar, there was a Freudian slip right there, the start of the signifier. The start of the seminar is quite interesting because we go back into the concerns of Schreber's God. Schreber's God gathers everything in and transforms it into this note-taking or writing down system. And a thought occurred to me, and I kind of want to play with it. And I don't know if it's going on a sort of spitball tangent, but it seems like when you look at this reference of Schreber being very intelligent and being a product of the Enlightenment being able to be scientific, rigorous, and free of superstition, and yet Schreber is now a believer of God and has proofs with these experiences of God in his delusions. And he's very certain. And yet when you look at his God and how God cannot predict the future, as you said, but can create it. And things that are created in the world that are contingent to the world and to the mortals he has no absolute knowledge of. He could only obtain knowledge by writing things down into this note-taking thing. And what I find interesting about this God is that it is as if we get an inversion of what we could think of as the modern science or the subjectivity of modern science and its ideology of constantly counting. We got a fact today, we got a fact tomorrow, but we can't account for the nature of reality or the totality of the world as a whole. And so I think what we see right here is a quite interesting inversion of the man of science projected into Schreber's God. Now, I don't want to get too lost into that, but I just thought that was kind of interesting to kind of play around with, Lacan's constant critique of science, the subject of science, and even in this seminar, Schreber as a product of enlightenment and how questions concerning theology and science seem to come up a lot in this seminar. Now, there is a conflict that we see, or opposition in Schreber's delusions and his overall language system, but it doesn't seem so far that it's in essence purely different from what we see as an opposition in language or the symbolic system of a neurotic. And at least for the neurotic and how the symbolic or the signifier functions in its elementary form is, as I said in the past, is the fluctuation of pluses and minuses, these absences and presences. So Lacan then says, okay, if Schreber has these conflicts and all that, well, where do they come from? And why is it that us as psychoanalysts are so attached to the question of delusions? We must ask ourselves, why are we so attached to this? And then he wants to take a jab at the constant fixation of psychiatry and ego psychology with the bipartition of a healthy ego versus the insane ego, or the mad ego, the unhealthy ego. Is as if we locate what this good ego, a healthy ego is, it would grant us the key to the mystery of what makes man insane, and thus find the cure. And Lacan seems to repeat this motif over and over again about the revisions of Freudianism, of ego psychology, and this insistence upon strengthening the ego, looking from the focal point of the ego. And we should know that in his early seminar, the very first seminar, that the ego is a misrecognition, and that what analysis, if it is a discourse that has an object, its object is the discourse of the unconscious, and that the unconscious makes itself known through the mediation of the ego. Let's look at what Verneinung is, but these affirmations in a negative form of the unconscious, the not mother, fresh brains, all these different scenarios that come up in a negative rejection of the plane of the imaginary, the ego, but at the same time avow a law of the unconscious. So then Lacan gives us this interesting analogy of the subject of the psychotic and the subject of the neurotic. And he says that the unconscious, or the psychotic, is a martyr of the unconscious, as well as the neurotic. And by martyr, he's using the original etymological meaning of being a witness rather than one committing suicide for their religious beliefs. But that the martyr in ancient Christianity was the one who was a witness to the resurrection of Christ, and thus gives a testimony of it. And he says that the psychotic has an open testimony versus the neurotic, who gives us a testimony that must be deciphered. What makes the two contrasting in the open and closed or deciphered testimony would be what he will end with. It will be our first opposition, the distinction between repression and foreclosure. So he then elaborates off of this interesting analogy with a homology that I think is very complex and takes a lot of time, but really shows us not only what is at stake with the nature of psychosis and neurosis, but also psychoanalysis as a discourse that situates itself within, you could say, an anthropological situation. Man's reason for being and the struggles that it has as a being. And so he says that we would think that slavery or bondage no longer exists, or that we don't even acknowledge it as such. But every sociologist or philosopher today would tell you that no, slavery will still exist in some form or the other. Maybe not slavery par excellence, but we still have bondages. We still live in a society where bondage exists, and in a sense, we have a sort of sublated form in the bondage of the bourgeois to the market economy, the exploiter to the market economy, and how it relies on the exploited to be able to live freely. And I say freely in quotes because Lacan brings up in this discourse of a duality of the master and slave is this repressed and potential secret discourse of liberation. And it's no surprise that this sounds similar to the master-slave dialectic, or even a surprise to even bring up Hegel, because he will even talk about how this type of discourse existed in the consciousness of Stoicism and Christianity, this promise of something from what is called brotherhood, this notion of liberation, which is misrecognized and becomes obfuscated by this discourse of freedom. And why I bring up Hegel is because we get this notion of liberation or freedom in the myth of origin called master-slave dialectic, the Lord and bondsman, something in which I want to actualize myself. I can only do so within the servitude and work that I do for the master that gives me recognition. And so to be recognized as somebody free is only to be recognized by an other. And so we have this kind of contradiction in this dialectic of consciousness to self-consciousness to self-consciousness and the other. But then that would be going too far into the Hegelian thing, but we see a homology right there, and I don't think it's inappropriate to evoke that, because I see definitely a similarity between Hegel and Lacan in this instance. But this homology brings up something interesting, because we go from understanding the repressed, or pointing out the repressed discourse of liberation and how it goes misrecognized by the revolutions that bring about what would be called a discourse of freedom, right? And Lacan says that this discourse of freedom and everything that is sort of structured upon it is it's actually its own obstacle from the progress of its object, its aim and its object. And he uses this, see, I have it written down. He says right here specifically that the modern revolution was founded on this distinction. The notion of the discourse of freedom was by definition not only ineffectual, but also profoundly alienated from its aim and its object. Everything probative that is a link to freedom is the enemy of the progress towards freedom. Anything that could be pointed out and evidential in society is actually its obstacle towards the aim of freedom. And we go back to this notion of counting, because when you look at the individual that would account themselves as free, can't give you a broad definition of what makes them free in totality. We only have, well, I'm free to own property. I have the freedom to pursue happiness. I have the freedom to enjoy food, to get an education, all of these particulars, and yet they don't amount to this notion of what is free. And yet also there is a huge problem in this discourse, because it brings about the notion of an other. Is the other free then? And what is your relation to the other then? And so to sum up this example, this homology that Lacan's bringing up, why the other becomes crucial is that, well, what's exposed is really a personal discourse of how one relates to their individuality and their sense of autonomy, but that it puts into question that if this is the general rule of the society that we live in, a society whose discourse is founded on freedom, then everybody must contribute their part. And yet everybody must live freely according to this sort of individual personal autonomy for these various things that are pointed out as free, and yet don't sum up or correspond to this universal notion of freedom. We have then something which we get a resignation or abandonment of reality, this sort of disappointment. And yet there is this sort of contradiction, because there's this failure to be able to be free, this recognizing that I can't obtain happiness, and yet I still, from what I understand, Lacan is saying this sort of free person sort of resigns from reality, quote, quote, reality, to continue to submit to this discourse. And it's no wonder that we see in, if you're tracking that Schreber, in a sense, has a similar thing in which reality, in a sense, is abandoned, and he lives in this reality that is no longer more, and in a sense, you could say resides from it, but it's like as if it's an open testimony for him, and in that it is this God that allows him to continue to pursue these certainties in his delusions and this hallucination. Now, I think this homology needs to be investigated a lot more, because not only does it bring up the problems of freedom, but also the way that there is an antagonism between the ego that would consciously see itself as free and living freely, and the unconscious, or the unconscious discourse, which is actually undermining itself, but also in a way which structures the continuation of the reality. Because in a sense, even if this reality or this discourse that makes itself an obstacle of its own aim sort of animates reality and animates society and allows it to further go. It's almost like, in a sense, the Fichtean anstas, the obstacle is its own movement. And we have, in effect, because of this, we could see a societal level, social level, people that would undermine their own happiness and think, should I get married? Should I get a job? Should I do this thing because it'll make me happy? And at the end of the day, now he's not really using these examples, but I'm kind of taking this in my own words. We would do this, and yet we would still not feel happy. We would still feel an antagonism from the law of freedom or discourse of freedom that we would adhere to, and the way that this obstacle undermines ourselves And we could put this simply as the way that, what we think we desire isn't what we desire at all. And to even get what we would desire would undermine ourselves. So it's like, does our freedom lead to liberation, or does it lead to more bondage or servitude? And we have the discourse of these psychiatrists and these psychologists that live in a sort of moralism or a call to consciousness or conscientiousness or conscience, to see this type of person and to make them avow it in a sort of interiorized individual form of being happy, of pursuing your own things. I mean, what Lacan is echoing in here is similar to what we see today with the ego, with maybe, you still see ego psychology going around, but with CBT, with the therapeutic culture, of affirming one's own conscience, of one's own happiness, of, the world, is indifferent, or people, want to do their own thing, but you need to affirm yourself. You need to affirm your own individual autonomy. But as Lacan says, in this contradiction of bondage and freedom, psychoanalysis does not pick a side in this common sense discourse. That psychoanalysis aligns itself with something of what presents itself in the form of symptoms and suffering of the subject. And this is what psychoanalysis, insofar as it aims at this revelation of symptoms with the structure of the subject of the unconscious, that we aim at something different. That, sure, freedom could always be there. Freedom may present itself in some form or the other, but psychoanalysis does not promise one liberation or freedom in the sense that we would desire it, or in the sense that was raised in this master-slave discourse that becomes sort of misrecognized. Now, for Lacan, then, what this problem of psychoanalysis, or this problem that psychoanalysis exposes itself to in relation to the suffering patient and the question of freedom, we then go back into Schreber and what Schreber has to tell us concerning his existence, concerning his being, and the way that he operates within a reality that has been lost, and yet he persists in a reality that is substituted by or structured by his delusions and hallucinations. And Lacan tells us, right before getting into the Schreber case again, that psychoanalysis, if it aims at anything, it aims at the effect of the discourse within the subject, and that is the subject of the unconscious. And so this brings us back to the question of, well, what is the relation of the subject to Schreber? Or should I say, what is the relationship of the subject of the unconscious and the unconscious to a psychotic like Schreber? Now, he goes into a passage that we could see on page 135 that I want to quote because I think it's really interesting. That Schreber tells us something interesting that really caught my eye, and I'll quote it right here. We're talking about structures, and so Schreber says, "They say I'm paranoid. As it happens, people at this time were still sufficiently bound to Kraepelin's first classification," this is Lacan, "to be described as paranoid, where his symptoms were much further than this." So pretty much paranoids were in relation to the paraphrenics that Freud was studying, and schizophrenia and dementia praecox, as it was called. So apparently this is a definition that was written in Kraepelin's psychiatric textbook. Schreber says, "They say I'm paranoid, and they say that paranoiacs are people who refer everything to themselves. In this case, they are mistaken. It's not I who refer to everything to myself. It is he who refers everything to me. It's this God who speaks nonstop inside me through his various agents and extensions. It's he who has the unfortunate habit, whatever I experience, of immediately pointing out to me that something is meant for me, or even that something comes from me. I can't play an aria from the magic flute. So right here, I think it's funny because Schreber is like, oh, they say I'm a paranoid because they say I refer everything to myself, but they're wrong. This is where Schreber actually gives them a sleight of hand. He's like, no, let me give you the reversal. It's actually he. But he's so certain about this he, and this he who's also unfortunate of sending him these messages and having to experience all this stuff or get all these messages from Schreber. But I mean, needless to say, what we're getting at right here is what makes me think of this importance of going back to understanding narcissism and secondary narcissism. Schreber said, I don't refer anything to myself. It's he, and unfortunately, he has to witness everything within me, and I can't, get rid of this guy who talks to me. And so there is the sense of this other, this he that he refers to, that somehow is outside of him, but also within him, and that this secondary narcissism is a sort of alienation in the sense of a verbal hallucination that structures Schreber's imaginary reality, or a reality imaginarized in a narcissistic investment. And narcissism is a libidinal and sexual investment. And I want to mark that key thing because there's something, or that term, sexual libidinal investment, because there's something important at the end of this lecture that Lacan points out that he leaves us with on a sort of cliffhanger. So now that we get into Schreber and his delusions, Lacan starts to emphasize something that is really important about the questions concerning hallucination, the signifier, and the real. And he even says that hallucinations are located in the real. And if they're located in this real, this external world that is all too real for Schreber, and he gets these hallucinations, these delusions, it brings into question the meaning of the function of signs, of naming things, and of an external reality that these signs correspond to. It makes us think that we really can't, again, talk about reality as it is, but it's always sort of structured or referred to by signs, signifiers. And the analysis of these verbal hallucinations, seem to derive some type of meaning, but it's almost, and again, from your last presentation, Max, it's almost like, it almost makes me think of the anticipation of meaning for Schreber when we get these incomplete sentences that Schreber is forced to complete in the anticipation of the God speaking, or the little soul speaking, or was it the birds that speak and they don't finish their sentence? And so Lacan points out that for Schreber, and again, this a relation between the signifier or signifiers and the real and the way it returns, is that it's trying to bestow some type of meaning. And these hallucinations, these messages are trying to refer something, but it's like as if in the anticipation of meaning, it's very hard for him. He gives us this analysis, or this analogy again of, or metaphor maybe, of deaf mutes. So it's like for Schreber's hallucination, it would be like a deaf mute who is seeing all of these hand signs communicate or refer to meaning to him, but getting lost into the specular image of the beautiful hands does not allow him to correlate the chain of meaning of whatever it is. Or another another example would be that one is unable to register meaning. A deaf mute is unable to register meaning of the hand signs because it's given in a language that he doesn't understand. And he doesn't even have to be a deaf mute. It's like, imagine reading a sentence written in a different language. You would anticipate that it is a language that is referring to something, but because you can't understand it, the sentence is a dead sentence. It's dead because the meaning cannot come to life and be delivered. And so for not only Schreber, but of this, what we would call the register of meaning phenomenon, is that it is of a signifier that conveys meaning. And in order for meaning to be conveyed to somebody, someone must be listening and speaking. Lacan says this is the front and back. It's like a coin, the front and back of a coin. You have listening and you have speaking. This is what allows for the other, or just signifier, to also come into play and to convey the meaning for the listener and the speaker, right? And then he gets into this example of Augustine talking about pointing, right? He says that a discourse is absolutely non-equivalent to pointing, or unequivocal, I think is the right term. What that means pretty much is that, like, pointing on itself does not equal a discourse, right? You need to have words. And so even certain things are not qualifiable to be a discourse without certain words to exist that allow for one thing: differentiation, or the word that he uses from Augustine, discernment, right? It's not enough that I point. Even if I point at you and I say you, right? Yes, I pointed at you, but that doesn't indicate anything about you other than you, right? And you'll use the example of pointing at an object. That's not enough to give a discourse, because it puts into question, what about the object? Is it its mass, its color, is it its weight? And so it's necessary for anything of a sign, whether it's pointing, or it's, in some countries, they don't even point. They like use their lips. They go like that. It's not enough to do that, but to also have words to be able to discern what's going on, or to have the space of differentiation, right? And so if I understood correctly, that what makes these things, possible is not only its differentiation, or allows for differentiation because we have other words, but we have a system of meaning that refers to something and is, in a sense, a network. And I think for the most part, Schreber is grappling with these delusions because of this anticipation of meaning that don't really have enough of the signifiers to really create a discourse. And to me, correct me if I'm wrong when we get into discussion, but it's still something that has to deal with the difference between the signifier and the master signifier that quilts meaning together, and Schreber's neologisms that only refer to things to itself. This self-referential thing versus differentiation that is made possible by S1, or a master signifier, which is both a unitary trait, or a unary trait, which is both identity and difference. And I think this is something that we could foreshadow with the question concerning the signifier. But I also want to evoke, because I'm getting close to the conclusion, again, what's talked about in not only the homology but in the beginning about opposition. And what we have in these two different clinical structures, psychosis and neurosis, and it's open and closed, right? And in this open system, this open testimony, it is this exteriority, this real, this reality of that is abandoned, where the signifier or a signifier, something that is trying to convey something, comes up in a delusional or hallucinatory form that is all too real. I mean, this is part of the title is the signifier in the real. And for Schreber, it is a signifier that comes up into the real versus a neurotic where something that is repressed, if it's a signifier that's repressed, is the return of the repressed. And repression is not something that is pushed down. It's in this cauldron of instincts. It's in this basement. It's this hidden fantasy of what you've always wanted. No, what it is something that rests within, we could say, the gaps of meaning of one's structure, like a cut, like almost like when you look at like a reel of film, how there's always gaps in between. It's not a continuous picture. And so we could kind of see how the semiotic chain of the signifiers act like that in those gaps. And we retroactively, through the inscription of the signifier in the neurotic patient, by the restitution of their past, they reconstruct something that was repressed via the signifier. And that is, in a sense, the function of not only retroactivity, but also in which something comes up in the speech that operates in non-meaning at first. The sort of imaginarized form of meaning is disrupted. And there is a signifier that comes up that doesn't really have any imaginary affectivity to it, but it is something that comes up from letter to signifier and yet holds all meaning together, versus something that appears in the real for Schreber and operates in a way that meaning is trying to be anticipated, and yet it is sort of hard for him to do because there's no sense of temporality. If I'm not mistaken, I could be wrong on that, but I always get this thing that like there is a sense of like anticipation, but a temporality where the evocation of presence and absence of the signifier comes up in Schreber. So kind of going too much into it, but to get to the conclusion of the entire the lecture or the seminar, Lacan brings up the connection of signifier or expression and a phenomenological experience. So he evokes this statement, the peace of the evening, right? Where does, or what is the link that holds this statement, the peace of its evening, or the peace of the evening, and the sort of experience one may feel during the evening? Or we could even say a beautiful morning. The term a beautiful morning and the phenomenological experience of waking up. And you could even see in like Disney films when the birds come at the windowsill and the princess starts singing. Or a modern example that everybody could agree with, I hate Mondays, right? It's like, where does, the signifier of like, oh, it's Monday or I hating Monday, then evoke the personal or phenomenological experience of hating Monday because you have to go to work, right? Does it come from within, or is it something where the limits of our discourse reach the reality of the world, the externality of the world, that sort of brings and bestows meaning onto us, if I'm getting Lacan's verbiage correctly, that at the limit of our discourse, at the limit of something that we can't speak of, the signifier throws itself onto us. That even when we see us talking about something, because we lack the language of it, doesn't mean that that's it, done deal. We just can't say anything about it. No. The real of our discourse, which can't touch meaning, or meaning can't touch in our imaginarized form, comes back. And thus, I mean, that's how signifiers come. That's how we are able to continue to create things, because the limit doesn't mean that's it. It's a closed system. No, language is incomplete. But for Schreber, there is this question of, well, what is the relation between this external world in which he communicates with these verbal hallucinations, which would be God, and the way that he is able to derive meaning? Is it similar to us? Does he feel the peace of the evening, or is it something all too horrific in the externality of the signifier in the real? And Lacan says that there is a signifier. There is a signifier to Schreber, but the subject of Schreber has a weird erotic fixation towards this signifier that returns into the real, that is not repressed, and a return of the repressed. And I think what this leads to is the investigation of the opposition of repression and foreclosure, but also, as I talked about earlier, this erotic fixation, which is grounded upon an imaginary reality, a narcissistic reality, which isn't a primary narcissism, but a substitute narcissism of a secondary nature, which still relies on these seesaw of aggressivity and eroticization.
I'm gonna tag on to a few things you said. I want to get out two main points, and then I will cede the floor to Max, give him the rest of the time. But I just want to articulate something that came to mind when you were talking about Schreber being this sort of post-Enlightenment figure, which is how he describes himself early in his memoir, right? Like, he was throughout most of his life pretty indifferent to the question of God, the existence of God. He's not an especially religious person. He's like many quote unquote religious people or avowed atheists, either completely against the notion of God or comfortably agnostic, right? But what's interesting about you pointing out the fact that in some sense he represents the subject of science is that his relationship with God in its eroticized form.
Mm-hmm.
We've already established that God for him is some sort of almost like simulacrum of the big other. What's fascinating to me about it is that this is a God who loves him, wants him, has chosen him, but is also a God whose limitations Schreber is viscerally aware of, and it's a major problem for him, you know. And what I thought was interesting about your observation there, about sort of gathering information, this endless anticipation of new ideas, new facts, new data, always on the horizon, that characterizes modernity and our relationship with God. Let's say someone who is a believer, considers themselves a Christian or Jew who believes in, let's say, in a monotheistic sense, a God who is theoretically all powerful, created the world. There's still this kind of suspension of that belief when it comes to a common sense approach to scientific discovery, even if it's not an avowed suspension. It's kind of like, well, that person could still read a study, read
Yeah.
Science Today or whatever scientific publication and be like, oh, okay, that's interesting. Scientists discovered this new thing. And then maybe after the fact be like, but God's still all powerful and it all comes from God. But it's almost like that's news to God too.
Mhm.
And with this discourse of freedom, what's interesting about it, it's like he's saying we all have this internal discourse that basically confers autonomy onto us, independence. And what are we independent from? Well, a God who rules by whim and caprice, right? So it's like that generalizes bondage.
Mhm.
This discourse of human brotherhood results in a generalization of bondage. It's only that he says something interesting here, and I want to relate two things he says. One, the nobody feels quite honest giving advice to anyone when it comes to matters of principle
Mhm.
in this modern era because, well, one, we don't know what the meaning of marriage is. For
Yeah.
instance, someone asks, should I marry this person? Nobody quite feels comfortable saying, yeah, definitely. You might say, well, okay, you love this person, but you've had a rocky history or whatever. You're not exactly financially stable. Maybe you should hold off. Or, yeah, go for it. But either way, you're going to feel like a little uneasy with the advice you gave because suddenly you're bumping up against this reality, which we, as he puts it, experience with a kind of resigned
Yeah.
abandonment. And suddenly, this idea of autonomy that we have and freedom, it's because all these irreconcilable notions of freedom suddenly clash with the reality we're presented with and this future contingent of people's decisions of what for Schreber is exactly what God cannot quite predict, even if he has a hand in it, as Max
Yeah.
pointed out. But what's fascinating is that, like, what he says here is that um, about thought. He says this is why one always comes back to the restricted, hesitant character of one's personal actions. And one only begins to think the problem is confused when one actually takes things in hand, qua thinker, which is not everyone's fate. So it's not everyone's fate to actually take these issues in hand as a thinker. Basically, not everyone's going to think about these things. The moment you start to think about these things, you're fucked
Yeah.
because you realize how little freedom you have. Schreber, on the other hand, we can't quite say he's thinking about these things, but he's forced to deal with this predicament,
Yeah.
this deadlock, because he's forced to be a martyr to the unconscious. He's forced to, in some sense, live out an imaginarized form of the structure of the unconscious. It's almost like for him, let's say for the neurotic, if the mind's like a kind of computer, we can know
Mm.
there's things going on behind the scenes. We know there's hardware. And that's how
Yeah.
most people think of the subconscious, right? It's like a kind
Yeah.
of hardware, there's wires, it's working on its own. I might know a little bit about computers, I might not. Either way, I can separate the images I see on the screen from what's going on behind the scenes. But for Schreber, it's like all of those fucking wires and everything, they're also clashing with the images. He can't distinguish it. So he has to deal with what's fascinating about it. It's not just the fact that he's psychotic and that people have misdiagnosed him as paranoid or misunderstood the nature of his delusion, but his delusion and his hallucinations are distinctly modern in this
Mhm.
way.
Yeah, they're modern and they're also alienated in the ego with God because his limitations are the fact that he could see that God has limitations, but yet God is constantly gathering in new information, and it's like there's almost this sort of like grandiose like um open testimony of the unconscious. Well, he's the open testimony. He's the martyr of the of
Yeah,
witnessing the conscious, and the unconscious is just witnessing the limitations because it is the discourse of otherness, and the
but
unconscious can be possible without the law of culture, of course.
And the last thing I'll say is, okay, so who is this big other then? And this is the interesting thing, is that we have a generalized notion also of a God of love, right? You know, my mom sent me this thing from the New York Times, this podcast that she wanted me to listen to. It was pretty bad. It was like a kind of progressive rabbi talking about Israel and Palestine, and just all of these platitudes about how, okay, Judaism is a religion of love and it shouldn't be one of persecution, and we need to come to terms with the universal aspect of, Judaism. Fine, nothing objectionable there, but it's kind of like everyone who is some kind of liberal is going to settle on this notion of a God of love, which is assumed. But if you think about like the Middle Ages, I don't think most people from peasant to monarch would go with God of love as the first definition of God. It's like the monarch is what? The kind of instantiation, the physical manifestation of God on earth, or his deputy in a sense. But we have a God who is the bondsman, right? And kind of recognized as such, and everyone is his vassal. Everyone is by definition enslaved in a sense, but in that way, marriage does have a distinct meaning.
Yeah.
That in this modern era where we can give God his due and like say he's up here and he's all powerful, but we aren't dependent on him.
And isn't that the sort of logic of Protestantism?
That's what's interesting. Yeah.
Isn't that also the sort of logic of Protestantism that Zizek brings up too? And it's also funny with the sort of medieval version of God where like he's all powerful, he's like the monarch of monarchs, the king of kings, and yet has the authority to appoint someone of divine right, or like a king because of divine right. It was given to me by God because God knows all and has the right judgment. So if I'm born a serf, it's because God wanted that. And that is God's.
I think it's already strange. I mean, I'm not an expert on Judaism, but doesn't the whole love thing only begin with Christianity?
It only begins with Christianity, yes. Because with Moses, God
isn't very loving.
Yeah, he's giving
kind of randomly striking people down, and there's no real logic to his law, right?
Yeah,
it's a reach. It's a reach for sure.
And in Christianity, we see that God was loving the whole time, from the Old Testament and the New Testament. We just have to read it a certain way. But God is always loving. Even Paul says that Moses was giving us the law of the God who loves us, and it is Christ, and yada yada yada. But that's like a theological thing that we could like get lost in the sauce with. But like for the sake of what we see in Schreber and what Lacan is evoking, and like what we are talking about, like the certain like sentiment or ideology of each mode of production, like from feudalism to capital, it's like, as Nick said, giving God his due, but at the same time, it's like, I'm not really, bonded by God. Like all these things that we still practice that were predicated on a sort of universal equivalent, which would be God and the fear of God, lose its sort of meaning. So like marriage, what was I destined to do in this life? It's all up to my autonomy, and my freedom to choose, so right. And even then, like there is this sort of predication of something universal, because of capitalism. We see this today, the market, and I like this example of Zizek's because I think it fits in perfectly with this whole notion of freedom and individual discourse, of the practical solipsist that could see problems going on in the world, economic problems and crises, inflation, the rise and lowering of certain prices, the low, how like we're running low on oil or all these other things. And the practical solipsist could be like, man, the world is just crazy these days, just like what's wrong with the economy? I remember back in the 80s, it used to be this, that, and the third. But then they walk around
They treat it
and
like the weather.
operate as if their life is predicated off of their free individual choices. They say, I'm a free individual. I believe in free speech. I believe in, the Second Amendment. And my philosophy is that, just to work hard, I make my own money, I earn my paycheck. There's this sort of disconnection.
Yeah, and they'll be like,
Maybe even disavow.
Democrat, Republican. I think both sides are crazy.
Yeah,
As
they're
if
the same
that's-
bird. They're the same bird.
I just wanted to come back to something that you said, Nick, because I liked it how you talked about the computer and the neurotic, right? And the hardware and so on. And I think that's a super good example because I feel like with the psychotic, he also has a hardware, like he has the computer, if we stay in that metaphor, but he kind of views it like a child. When you would imagine you being a child and you try to understand a computer, you would kind of imagine little men in there that move things around, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's kind of like that. It's like imaginarizing. For the neurotic, it's really ones and zeros and so on. It's like really this abstract, untangible logic going on. But for the psychotic, it's like, yeah, it's little men doing all of that. But I wanted to also say something about the whole thing about freedom. But before I do that, I wanted to say something about the hands, right? Because the way I read the hands, when he talks about the hands of the deaf mute person, right? Kind of related to the bellowing miracle, which we haven't mentioned yet, really.
Yeah, I failed to mention that. I had that in my notes, but I didn't mention it. Yeah.
I mean, I'm not 100% sure, but I want to tell you my understanding of what he's saying, and then you can tell me what you think. Okay, so I was thinking he mentions these hands to kind of say that if you treat the hands as signifiers, that would immediately imply that you experience an anticipation of meaning, right? So he kind of uses it as an example. When something makes sense, it doesn't make sense to you. It's only the anticipation of sense, right? And discourse is like this endless anticipation of sense. To what end? Then he asks, right? To the end of some being.
Mm-hmm.
We never reach that being. It's just endlessly deferred. But then he talks about the fringe of discourse. So the only thing we reach is a kind of fringe of discourse. And that's where discourse touches on the real. But what is that fringe of discourse if not a signifier that has no signifier, right? It's that end of the line where there's nothing but this signifier that is nothing but lack, right? Represents nothing but lack. And that's, to me, what he was saying, because he mentions, I think even on the last page, so he talks about the whole bellowing miracle and so on. And then he says, we need to know how this unconscious signifier is situated in psychosis. Yes. So this signifier that's on the fringe of discourse is, that's how I read it, is what is the unconscious for the neurotic. Right. That's an unconscious signifier. But for Schreber, this signifier that is on the fringe of discourse is what is the signifier in the real, because he doesn't have repression, so it doesn't become unconscious. Yeah. It really is in the real. And I think what he's trying to say with all the miracles and so on that appear when God distances himself is that this is the psychotic experience, which is imaginarized, of this signifier at the cusp or at the fringe of discourse. And it is a signifier that represents nothing. And I feel like all these phenomenons he tries to mention, he mentions that appear in Schreber's delusion are like imaginarized instances of this signifier on the cusp of discourse, right? And he doesn't really interpret them. I mean, he interprets them a little bit. He's like, yeah, a scream, that's kind of like a signifier that signifies everything and nothing. And
Right.
then
Yeah.
screaming for
Yeah.
help.
Yeah, and I think like I
How to
worded
interpret that?
when I brought up the example of the metaphor of the the deaf mute, like
Yeah,
in the hands, that like I was focusing more on the metaphor of seeing the hands move, but getting sort of lost in the sort of image of how beautiful they are, so
yeah,
you never quite see what the hands convey and what signs they are. And I think in a sense there's the aspect of delusion, or the way that the hallucinations come up, where because they have such an imaginarized investment, and that could be because of the narcissism, that you never convey the sequence of meaning. But I totally agree with what you're saying, because it's like for the psychotic, right? There is something which is on the fringe of being a discourse, but because it's so imaginarized that you never really get, which is the key term to go back to example of a pointing, you never get other signifiers which have everything in common with another signifier besides the what I mentioned, which was foreshadowing the S1, is differentiation, or as Augustine says, discernment. And that's what would create a discourse proper, and even something that would have limits, which would lead us to the real of the discourse. And the real of the discourse, speaking for an erotic, but then also of, like, let's say, science, is it's sort of anstos. It's the that of freedom is an anstos, because its own impossibility is its regeneration. It's itself generating thing, which allows the discourse to be possible, even if it's an
yeah,
impossibility. So we got this condition of possibility and impossibility, but with the way that these hallucinations function, it's as if there is this anticipation, but you never quite get meaning, because you never get anything that has differentiation, like the scream, these different miracles, right? And especially like with the one part, because he's got like the four structures, or the four lists of Schreber's linguistic system, and the last one being the blasting of wind that stops Schreber's thinking. Like there's always like these abrupt disturbances that keep continuity from happening.
Well,
but
here's
the
a question
blast
for
of
both of you
wind.
though.
Sorry.
I just want to, not to cut you off, but like just because I have a relevant quote here near the end, but like, because he talks about these complementary oppositions, that we need to
Mhm,
read the psychotics hallucinations as complementary oppositions if we're
mhm,
going to be good psychoanalysts. And then he begins with an opposition, right? He begins with the lecture with this opposition of the plus and
right.
minus, and the equiprobability of choosing one or the other. That's the signifier, at least for Lacan at this stage. And then, like what you're talking about, this sort of signifier on the fringe, Max, it's like we're anticipating here foreclosure because it's a signifier in the real. And it seems like, if I'm not mistaken, these responses, which are of a linguistic order, the bellowing miracle and the call for help, are almost like defense formations when God begins to withdraw in order to maintain his own subjective um, consistency for
Yeah.
himself. And for the neurotic, this withdrawal of God would be when the desire of the other, the discourse of the other, is punctured or revealed as such, and then we get the return of the repressed, and then you get a kind of like resistances
Mhm.
in the face of that. But anyway, I'm sorry to
But
I mean,
and that brings
maybe I
into
did.
question the relation, with both of you guys that are pausing, whether we're talking about what you're evoking, these linguistic systems, especially the as defenses with the call for help to avoid God distancing themselves, and what you're saying, Max, as the fringe of the signifier. I think reconcile themselves in this last paragraph in 142, section 161, where he's talking about that there is an unconscious signifier situated in psychosis, and its exteriority, the way that it operates on hallucination or delusion, has this operation in disturbances of reality and an erotic fixation. Like the subject has this erotic fixation, which I corresponded it to the narcissistic investment of Schreber, and also the way that it operates in a disturbance of reality, in a disturbance of what his reality is, which is still, it's structured by the psychosis and the delusions and stuff like that. It's both its structuration and its disturbance. Like there's this weird seesaw, because it goes back to like, he wants to unify with God as his lover, but at the same time, if God enters into him, he dissolves, right? Like Schreber dissolves. And so we're always dealing with
God,
these weird,
like
or God,
actually
yeah,
God, and
it's
that's why
God that
God is
dissolves, yeah.
afraid, right?
Yeah. So we're always met with these weird oppositions or contradictions. And
I
it's
mean,
like as if sublation still works in a sense, because he does mention Alphabon in the last chapter, but it's like we're still dealing with in an imaginarized order that must function on something, right? And he's like, there is a signifier. So it's like right here, we're getting to know that, well, when we talk about the symbolic, um, we have, signifiers and stuff like that. We have an S1, but like there is something like a signifier that still makes itself appear for Schreber, but it doesn't operate in the same way that we're used to seeing with the neurotic patient.
I mean, I think I couldn't express perfectly what I wanted to say. So what I tried to say was kind of like, so of course, now I kind of learned through reading this, the psychotic and the neurotic, they have the same symbolic order. It's just in a different location, right? And for the neurotic, there is this signifier that is on the cusp of the discourse, right? Which would where in the famous television quote, like where the language hangs onto the real, right?
Right.
That lack in the symbolic order. That's the unconscious signifier. And this also exists for the psychotic. It's just outside, and it appears as a hallucination, as an imaginarized thing, like little people in my computer, kind of like. So the abstract logic appears as hallucination, as something that you hear or see or whatever. And I kind of read all these miracles as instances where this signifier that hangs onto the real, that is on the cusp of the real, or of discourse, appears. And I don't think it's necessary defense, because it's not the defense of God, I think, because, for example, who calls for help? It's kind of the soul. So when God like distances himself, some of these souls, they fall off, kind of, and they die, and that's why they call for help.
Right.
Such a cute image.
Right, because it's the extensions, which they are the ones that really operate in the world, because God really doesn't have any affairs with the mortal world, right? Yeah.
He's not really there, right? That's why he never comes close enough, right? And then this bellowing miracle is something that comes from Schreber, right? It's like him. It's not God that's defending himself. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's more like he experiences the edge of discourse where there is the lack in the signifying order. And this appears as this hallucination. Whereas for a neurotic, probably how would you experience it? As a symptom, because that's what repression is.
Yeah.
This lack doesn't appear outside. It appears as what is hidden by a symptom in some sense.
Well, what characterizes, or the symptom in some sense, is like this compromise, right?
Yeah.
It's like it's a compromise, and neurosis, I feel like, is a compromise which always fails. In a sense, psychosis fails too, but much more catastrophically, right?
Yeah.
Because you can't operate in society. But what's interesting, we have our shared delusion of our freedom and autonomy. The less
yeah.
we think about it, the better. We'll probably make more money that way, not thinking about these kind of conundrums. But what's interesting to me is that he says that how what's foreclosed, the signifier, it shapes the subjective topology. It's an unconscious signifier. It shapes the subjective topology of, let's say, Schreber's life world. For the neurotic, the compromise here might work better. For some people, their symptom carries them through their entire lives. They don't have to go to analysis. Most people don't. But what's interesting to me is, and what I don't think I quite had a grasp of before reading this seminar, is the fact that, you think, oh, what the psychotic forecloses returns in the real, and that's just like this big monstrosity of hallucination. But for the neurotic, and I'm quoting Michael Downs here, who I think was quoting Todd McGowan, who says that maybe we should think about the unconscious in terms of semiotic gaps and not just signifiers waiting to be articulated. It's also the gaps in the signifiers. I think you were alluding to something like this earlier, Andrew. And it's
Yeah.
like we have these resistances that the neurotic shows, and his symptom needs to be deciphered. Nothing needs to really be deciphered in the same way for the psychotic, but this signifier, let's say, that's unconscious, that's foreclosed, is also unknown to the psychotic, who is the martyr of the unconscious, who witnesses things that the neurotic absolutely does not. But that doesn't mean that he knows what that signifier is any better than the neurotic knows what they've repressed. But there's always the return of the repressed. What we're witnessing here is the return of the repressed, but in the form of a complete breakdown of the imaginary symbolic life world of Schreber. But the structure is pretty much the same.
Yeah, I think so too. Totally. I think, and when I read this chapter, I was like, well, sometimes, as you also said, Andrew, sometimes we imagine the unconscious as like, okay, with Freud, it's like where all the drives are that are animalistic, at least in the caricature of Freud, right? And with Lacan, well, it's a bunch of words, I guess, right? But really, it's not a bunch of words lying around somewhere and we don't know about them. It's more the gap that is created by the symbolic system.
Yeah.
And how you deal with it.
Right. And the importance of it, because look, like Freud he got close to it in screen memory. And then of course he mentions time in his unconscious essay, if I'm not mistaken. But the notion of time that he's dealing with in that essay is the more classical conception of time than in screen memory, when he's actually introducing troglodyte retroactivity, that the unconscious manifests for Lacan in that screen memory type notion of time, of retroactive temporality, which there is a pulsation, which of course he hasn't really mentioned that there, but this is where he will describe the unconscious as in Seminar 11. And so the temporality is the manifestation of those semiotic gaps that come about in speech within the transference. And it's something that shows that, well, the unconscious isn't just, this thing that's just waiting dormant, or it's like this inner world, like a Jungian or a Hillman type, definition or topology of the unconscious, where it's like it's its own inner world and landscape that we have to be on its own terms. Of course, you have to be on the own terms of the unconscious because it speaks differently, but it's not a matter of inner, worldly processes. It's something that is actually alienated in the speech because it is in this gaps that resist the meaning or resist the trauma or the lack of coherency of the subject. We can even think about like that concept that marks the time of the subject and this martyrdom of the unconscious, which is that German term that Lacan uses that I asked you about, Unbegriff. This is what is the aspect of the birth of the subject, which becomes unconscious and is the real, the marking of the real, which constantly returns in the form of the repression for the neurotic. And that is what the neurotic constantly becomes a martyr towards and does not know what it means.
I'm gonna make a crazy claim to add on that. I'm not sure about it, okay? But now that we're talking about this, and he says this unconscious signifier in the singular, maybe you could say there is only, if there is a place of the unconscious, it is only one signifier at a specific moment in time where this lack is at that moment located in some sense, and it moves temporarily.
Yeah, that's actually right. That would.
Is that the unary trait?
Yeah, that would be the unary trait, because you never get you never. I mean, it always goes back to let's think about chapter 1 of Zizek's For They Know Not What They Do. It's like you never get this pure signifier. You always get a signifier that's always already in an inversion, and so what makes every other signifier at a point of time in relation to the S1 as unary trait is that ability to quilt it or to make it a universal equivalent, which is both identity and difference. It's the axiom that a signifier represents the subject for another signifier, which is homologous to identity is the identity of difference. That
I was
just
just going to ask a naive question after you go.
Good.
I'd like to end us on a naive question, but
okay, I want to make some crazy claims
Yeah.
before. Yeah, good. Okay. I'm going a dangerous path, okay? But I want to add another concept in here that's not in the text, right? But we have talked about it before, the letter, right? And we talked about the materiality of the letter, right? And maybe these instances of, for example, the bellowing miracle is an instance of the letter in the sense that there at the edge of discourse, there is literally the materiality of the signifier without any meaning. What is the materiality of the signifier? He kind of hints to that, but doesn't completely explain it. But it's like, yeah, screaming, the voice in that sense. And
that's not too far off.
The wolf.
Yeah.
This is what the baying of the wolf is, a signifying, but contains all signifiers.
Yeah, it's that's not too far of like a sort of like hot take, because he will mention something like this in seminar 18 with the lettre litre, and he makes this like example of like the he says there's really no harmonious connection between the shore and the sea, the land and the ocean. And so the letter is kind of like on this sort of periphery of
the littoral zone.
The littoral zone, the littoral zone. So I think that's an interesting connection, and that's
also the wind kind of fits into that, because the wind always appears when Schreber stops thinking, and when he stops thinking, then God also distances himself, and that's when the wind starts blowing. And the second idea I now got, maybe it's wrong, I can't prove it, okay? But we talked about time, and there is time in Schreber, and what's the most extreme manifestation of time is, of course, this distancing and coming closer, right? And maybe you could link getting closer to him to this approach of being, so that we finally get closer to being. And this distancing is the moment when this lack then appears, right? Because that's when all these horrible things happened, or the bellowing miracle and so on. So then meaning again vanishes in this lack that is produced, right, through the signifying chain that actually is based on anticipation of meaning. But when you reach that anticipated signifier, well, what do you get? Nothing but lack. See where I'm going? But I haven't thought it through. That's just an idea I just had now.
I mean, that kind of reminded me of the Stickleback Fair with
Yeah.
the
Mhm.
distancing and the approach, right? There, it's eroticized, right? And I think that's one thing we didn't talk about. Exactly why are these complementary hallucinations eroticized? You know, there is an erotic element to the
Mhm.
fact that maybe even Luder, which is both kind of flirtatious and denigrating
Right.
simultaneously. It's
Yeah.
like,
And I think a lot of that has to do with like reading the sort of case study interpretation that Freud gives with these notions of homosexuality and Schreber, masturbatory fantasies, and narcissistic investment um, towards all that. And I think when he means eroticization, not necessarily just in the sexual, uh, well, all libido sexual, but like as far as like him having some type of sexuality to it, but that there is a libidinal uh, investment in this that maintains his structure. You know, this
I always read it as imaginary in the sense of the image usurping
right. It's
the
a
place
space.
of the subject, and this love-hate relationship that one has with their own image in the
Yeah.
mirror, and
And
how
so
that signifier comes to take the place of the image in that sense. Gets hooked
right.
to it,
And so
condenses
look,
it.
what Lacan says is pretty interesting at the end of Seminar One, because it's like, well, this relation between love hate, there's a thin line, right? And it's the symbol, it's a signifier. So like when the signifier is lacking, and he'll reiterate this in Seminar Four, when the signifier is lacking, there is where the convergence of love hate comes about, this sort of aggressivity um, of the imaginary meeting the real. And so the sort of pact or bond that keeps people from bumping into each other like bumper cars is the
Yeah.
signifier, the name of the Father, right? And so when that lack of it is exposed or goes missing, we get this dialectic. Well, this dialectic seizes and it just kind of becomes like mushed together of hate love, right? Of uh not only wanting the other but possessing the other and mutilating the other, which happens for neurotics. Really, it's not just a psychotic thing, but because it's like he doesn't have the sort of signifying chain that we see in neurotics. It's like the closer he gets to God, the more like that question of Luder makes him act like a stickleback. Like what does he do? You know, is this am I prey or am I a mate? You know, like in the way that the stickleback operates. Because for lack of a better term, it's like this the aggressivity and eroticization become kind of condensed into one that's kind of confusing in the image.
And maybe I could imagine that you could say, if you say that God is this discourse that always produces a lack, right? Um, then what is this lack? Of course, desire. And that's how this discourse relates to Schreber also. But it's like this, it's the whole dynamic of an abstract logic in a register that's imaginary.
Mhm.
So it's, yeah. He says that in the beginning also. He says like this God that is for Schreber entirely discourse.
Mhm. Yeah, that's true. He does say that. Yeah.
It's funny how desire is displaced onto God. Does Schraber ever say, I really want anything? You know,
Never,
he's
ever.
wanted.
He
He
is
wants
completely wanted. Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
I mean, he has something. The whole book is about, he has the whole problem in the universe, because he always speaks about it in the sense that once there was a world that was fine, but what happened? He got too sexy, right? That's what happened.
You got too sexy for a shirt.
Yeah.
What happened? I got too sexy. Oh my, that's
That's
so good.
He's too nervous and too voluptuous, whatever that means.
Voluptuous,
I guess it means he's super hot, right? And that's what plunges the whole world into chaos because God is so into him. That's the whole story. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
it's funny because it's the neurotic needs to be kept at bay from their desire. That's what they fear the most. So it's like what they
Yeah.
bring to the table in analysis is I like what Zupancic said about the symptom. It's not a problem, it's the solution to a problem that you've
Right.
already devised, but that
Yeah.
maybe stopped working in a sense. You bring that to the analyst saying, cure me, fix me, whatever, but you're already presenting them with the solution to your problem, which in a sense distances you from what the symptom wants to articulate, which is a desire that doesn't agree, let's say, with an ego ideal in some sense, but continues to insist. But it's just funny for Schreber, he's desired, and there's a not perversity in the sense of the clinical structure, but there's a kind of perversity and endless eroticized, sexualized kind of multiplicity of images that he comes up with, and he's not ashamed. He's definitely not ashamed of the fact that he's God's wife, that he's going to be impregnated. He's no wonder Deleuze and Guattari loved
Right,
him.
right. But and then also not just like that, like, God desires everything from him, but it's just like even in the instance of trying to like uh the counter argument against Kraplin, like, oh, they say that I'm paranoid because I refer to everything to myself, but it's he who refers everything to me. It's just like, no, this he refers everything to me. So and it's also funny of that because he doesn't say they say I'm paranoid. I don't think I'm paranoid. No. Instead he says it's not myself who refers everything, or me that refers everything to myself. He rather says it's he who refers everything to me. And so it's like he doesn't really deny that he's paranoid, he just denies the definition. So that's another interesting thing too. That's the way I read it.
Yeah.
We'll have to pick that up next time though, because it's 6:30. I have to go. Very, very. This episode was a twin that is big with delusion.
Yeah.
That's the name of one of the subchapters of the next lecture.
Yeah.
I just wanna add one last thing, okay? I just want to say something about shame and about like foreclosure, right? So the funny thing is with Schreber, somewhere in the ending of the book, there is a letter. I forgot to whom he wrote it, but it's some kind of official thing. I don't know if it's a court or something. And he sees his whole thing as very logical and as just something that happens to him. And he's like, I know this sounds weird, but this has nothing to do with my desire. I'm not into being sissified, okay? Yeah. So I don't know if he's lying there or if he really thinks that, but I guess if he's really psychotic, he thinks it has nothing to do with him. But of course, it's a foreclosure of, you could say his desire, but then it's already iffy because we know there's no ego that's individual and so on. But it's in some sense his desire that is foreclosed and returned to the real. And I would propose maybe we could do one round talking about Freud's text on him.
Yeah.
Because he's very
Yes,
clear
that would be great.
What is foreclosed, and it has a lot to do with his father and his brother and so on. Yeah, so maybe we should do that too.
Oh, definitely.
I'm thinking of the one psychotic he mentions in another text, where it's like a woman who reads a book and it reminds her too much of having sex with her husband or something, and then literally the text of the book reappears as a voice she's hearing. So it's kind of like neurosis. It's just, it comes from the outside. It's not your hidden desire you're ashamed about. It's just the outside world that is.
Yeah. And that can happen for neurotic too,
Yeah.
Not to bring something else up, but like a neurotic can also have hallucinations.
Yeah. Wolfman.
Wolfman.
Yeah.
Shout out to Wolfman. All right. Until next time.